I've always loved the quiet of early evening, the hour when the sun lowers itself behind the treetops and the piano room fills with amber light. It's my favorite time to teach. The house breathes differently when it's just me and the piano, the rest of the world tucked somewhere outside those tall glass windows. And recently, that space has belonged to someone else too. Julian was the neighbor's son. 21, tall but unsure of himself, and too quiet to be noticed in a room unless someone asked him a direct question. His mother, Leah, asked me if I'd consider giving him piano lessons over the summer break, said it would help his focus, give him something to do other than retreat into books and silence. I said yes out of habit, not excitement. I didn't expect it to matter. He came the next afternoon. Wore a blue shirt too big for him, sleeves pushed halfway up. Hair still damp like he'd been too nervous to dry it properly. He looked around the room like he didn't belong, even though I'd cleared the space just for him. "Julian," I said, stepping into the room with a smile. He nodded, eyes catching on the baby grand piano. "Yes, sir. Adrian is fine." He sat down with hesitation, not touching the keys until I motioned him forward. The first few minutes were stiff, awkward. He knew the notes but not the feel. I sat beside him and tried to make him relax. My fingers brushed his to adjust the angle of his hands, and that was the first time I felt it, that slight tremble. Barely noticeable. But it was there. Julian didn't say anything. His eyes dropped to the keys and stayed there, but he didn't move his hand away either. I told myself it was nerves, performance anxiety, whatever you want to call it. But a small part of me noted how aware he suddenly became of my closeness. I didn't pull away immediately. That was my first mistake. The lesson went on. I kept it professional. Mostly. Still, I noticed everything. How he focused so hard his jaw clenched, how he flinched at loud sounds, how he smiled so softly you'd miss it if you blinked. He came again 2 days later. And then twice the following week. Each time, he was a little less unsure. Each time, that piano bench felt a little more like the center of something I hadn't named yet. My husband, Thomas, was away as usual, another sales convention in another state. I used to mind the silence his absence left behind. Now, I found myself listening for Julian's footsteps on the walkway just before 5 p.m. Nothing about this felt intentional. Not at first. I told myself I was just mentoring someone sensitive. That I was filling a quiet space with music, nothing more. But I started choosing softer pieces for him to learn, more emotional compositions, songs that invited feeling rather than precision. Julian responded to them. He played better when the notes carried weight. He let his fingers linger on the keys like he was trying to say something without words. During one lesson, he stumbled over transition. I placed my hand over his to guide the movement. Again, that tremble. Stronger this time. He looked at me for a moment, just long enough to make my chest tighten. Then back to the keys. Still, he didn't move away. I didn't either. After he left, I sat at the piano alone and stared at the space he had just occupied. I told myself again that it was nothing. I was being dramatic. He was a student. I was married. But the human mind is a messy thing. And the heart. Even messier. Later that night, I sat beside Thomas on the couch. He was scrolling through emails, distracted, muttering about flight delays and client meetings. I watched him, familiar and distant all at once, and thought about Julian's hands on the keys. How present he seemed. How much I'd missed that kind of attention. I didn't say a word. Neither did Thomas. That's how our evenings usually ended these days. Together, yet entirely alone. The next time Julian came, he brought a piece he wanted to learn himself, Debussy. Emotional, fluid, and raw. When he played the first few notes, I sat silently and listened. Something inside me shifted. Not loudly. Just enough to make me notice. I watched his fingers glide over the keys. Watched the way his body leaned in with each chord like he needed the music more than the breath in his lungs. And when I reached out again, to correct his form, to teach him better, I felt it. He shook. And I didn't pull away. The next few lessons blurred into each other, not because they were uneventful, but because I became obsessed with how controlled I had to be. Julian arrived exactly on time every session. Still quiet, still polite, but something behind his eyes had changed. There was a new presence to him. He didn't speak much unless I asked him to, but when he did, he looked straight into me. And I had to remind myself, sometimes out loud, that he was just a student. I wasn't supposed to feel seen by someone nearly a decade younger than me. Especially when I had a husband. Thomas was still away, now in Chicago for a full week. We spoke on the phone only twice, each conversation short, filled with logistical chatter about bills and deadlines. When I asked how he was sleeping, he muttered, "Better than when I'm home." No offense. I laughed, even though something in me sank a little deeper. That week, Julian stayed after his lesson longer than usual. He had struggled with a difficult piece, a haunting melody that didn't quite sit comfortably in his hands. He kept playing the intro over and over, frustrated. I placed my hand gently over his and guided his fingers again. This time, he didn't just tremble. He sighed. Quietly. Like he had been holding something in for far too long. Our hands stayed like that, together, longer than necessary. Still, I didn't pull away. "I can't get it right," he whispered, finally breaking the silence. "You're close," I replied. "Just stop overthinking the next note. Feel it, don't force it." He looked up at me, our faces closer than they should have been, and asked something unexpected. "Is that what you do? Feel it instead of force it?" I couldn't answer. Not without unraveling. So I laughed instead. Awkwardly. Pulled back. Told him to take a break. We didn't speak about it. But the air had changed. Charged with something neither of us admitted aloud. That Friday, a thunderstorm rolled in around sunset. The lesson was already underway when the rain started hammering the windows, and the power flickered out halfway through. I lit 2 candles from the shelf and set them near the piano. The room was dim and warm, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking about chords or posture. Just the way the flickering light painted Julian's face in soft shadows. He began to play one of the older pieces we'd practiced, a simple, emotional tune we both knew by heart now. No sheet music. No instruction. Just his fingers, the keys, and the sound between us. I sat beside him, saying nothing. Watching. When he reached the final note, he let it linger in the air longer than necessary. Then he turned to me. "That felt better," he said, almost to himself. I nodded, trying to stay still, pretending I hadn't noticed how close we were. It did. He looked at me for a long time. No tension. Just waiting. I should have stood up. Should have clapped my hands and called it a great session. Should have reminded him he was my student. That I was married. That this was nothing. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder. It was meant to be harmless. Encouraging. Gentle. But when I did it, he reached up slowly and placed his hand over mine. Neither of us moved. The storm outside deepened, wind rattling the windows, and yet the room was utterly still. I could hear my heartbeat, loud in my ears. His eyes didn't drop. He didn't smile. But he didn't let go either. It was the kind of moment that builds itself slowly over time, through repetition, silence, and stolen glances. A moment that should have never arrived, and yet, here it was. A buzz cut through the quiet. Julian's phone. He flinched. I pulled my hand back. "It's my mom," he said, voice low. "She's outside." I nodded. "You should go." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more. But he didn't. He picked up his satchel, gave a nod, and stepped out into the storm. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, hand still tingling from where his had been. Upstairs, the bedroom was cold and untouched. The bed half-made. My reflection in the mirror stared back like a stranger. Someone who hadn't planned for this. Someone who didn't know how far things had gone until silence proved louder than words. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the storm long after it ended, asking myself what would have happened if his phone hadn't rung. And hating that part of me was disappointed that it did. Days passed. No texts. No knocks at the door. No lesson at 5 o'clock. I told myself it was normal, Maybe he had other things going on, maybe his parents cancelled without telling me, maybe I was just reading too much into what had happened. But the truth was, the silence hurt more than it should have. I kept looking at the piano bench like it would still carry his shape. I practiced alone that week. Played pieces we'd once worked on together. My fingers found his progress in the keys, little details I'd helped him correct. I wondered if he'd kept playing without me. Thomas came home 2 days later. The trip had gone well. He brought back a bottle of wine and stories I'd heard variations of 100 times. We had dinner like old friends, carefully avoiding the subject of anything too personal. That night, he reached for me in bed. Gently, like he remembered something we used to be. I kissed him back, but it didn't feel right. My body responded on instinct, but my mind was elsewhere. I felt split, like part of me was still in the piano room, sitting beside someone who had looked at me like I mattered in ways I didn't know I'd missed. The next evening, just as the sun dropped behind the rooftops, I heard a knock. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Julian stood there, hood pulled up, holding his music notebook in one hand. His eyes were unreadable, but his breath was tight, like he'd debated coming here at all. "I think I left this," he said. "You did," I replied, stepping aside. He walked in slowly, like he was retracing his steps through something too delicate to disturb. The piano stood in silence, keys untouched. "I've been practicing," he said softly. "It doesn't sound the same without, here." I nodded. I didn't know what to say. He sat down on the bench. I remained standing, unsure what rules still applied between us. Then he said, "I shouldn't have stayed that long the other night." "It wasn't your fault." "It wasn't yours either," he said, eyes fixed on the keys. "But something happened." I swallowed hard. Yes, something did. He turned toward me. His voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what it was, but it's not gone." I moved to sit beside him, not touching. The space between us felt like a wound trying to close. "I think about it," I admitted. "More than I should." He looked down. "Me too." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was honest. Too honest. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You taught me more than just music." I stared at him. "You showed me how to feel something fully," he continued. "Even if it's confusing. Even if it hurts." I breathed out slowly. "Julian, I'm married." "I know. This can't be anything." "I didn't come here asking for it to be." We both fell quiet again. Then, without a word, Julian leaned slightly forward. He didn't kiss me. He didn't reach for my hand. He just rested his forehead gently against mine. A soft, fleeting contact. And still, somehow, the most intimate moment of my life. I didn't move. Neither did he. The moment held. And then he stood, notebook pressed to his chest, and walked to the door. "Goodbye, Adrian." I didn't stop him. I sat there on the piano bench long after he left, staring at the candle stub still sitting near the edge, a reminder of the night the storm almost drowned us. Upstairs, Thomas was watching a movie. He called my name once. I answered like nothing was wrong. But everything was different now. That night, I laid beside my husband in bed, unable to sleep.